say welcome to today's very important conference, because I think this is what everybody is actually talking about at the moment, which is freedom of speech, or the lack of it. I heard a very interesting news item this morning about what was happening to China, about the repression of free speech and the way organizations are being locked out of the media and how awful it is. And I couldn't help but sense the real hypocrisy of what is going on with the establishment. Now, let me make it plain. I think what's happening in China is awful. And, you know, what's happening with the Uyghurs is awful. Imprisoning of activists, taking away the bank accounts of activists, the computers of activists is terrible. But let us be very clear. There is something similar happening in this country. There are Palestinian activists who are having their computer, hardware, software taken away. There are activists who are being systematically locked out of social media. And we have now the Labour Party behaving as a major agent of both political control and political repression. And so this is a really apt point for us to be talking about this. I'm not going to say much, but just to add, 5 years ago, when much of this really kicked off, and just to remind you of how that kicked off, that was with Nash Shah and Ken Livingstone and myself. It felt as if nobody really understood quite what was happening. And certainly I felt like a sort of messenger in the wilderness, because I and a number of other people could see where this was inevitably going to lead. And I mean inevitably. This moment is a consequence of those actions 5 years ago, and they're a consequence of not just what the establishment did, but what groups who align themselves with the left also did in the way they responded to the repression of free speech and the witch hunt. What we need to do at this point is to not forget those important lessons. Now, some people say, well, it's all done and dusted now, you know, everything's lost. It's not lost. The fight is never lost. The fight always goes on. The fight is now for clarity and for truth and to continue speaking out. So the lineup we've got today are all people who have been personally and politically involved in what's been going on. And I think they all have worthwhile things to be saying. So first of all, I'd like to introduce my comrade and of course partner, Graham Bash. I'm going to leave it to people themselves to introduce themselves. I think they'll do it much better than I would ever do it. But Graham Bash should be well known to everybody. He has been active in politics, as he may well tell you, in Labour politics for 55 years, and has a wide and deep knowledge of what has been going on and the history of the Labour movement. So Graham, over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. Firstly, 2 apologies. Sorry for having to leave so quickly after I speak. Trying to juggle meetings, I'll be back as soon as I can. And secondly, for those comrades in Kent left who attended the meeting on Tuesday, sorry, but I'm going to say very much a similar thing, so go off and have a cup of tea if you don't want to hear it again. Now, we're at a critical moment fighting for free speech simultaneously at a number of different levels. Firstly, of course, in the Labour Party. Now, it's 52 years, Jackie, not 55. 52 years ago, almost to the day, I joined the Labour Party. I've been a member ever since. And without doubt, this is the worst attack on free speech I have ever experienced. Even war criminal Blair never attempted to silence the opposition. A number of us face the threat of expulsion if we insist on telling the truth about Jeremy Corbyn, about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, on the report of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, even speaking on the same platform or defending those like Jackie, Chris Williamson, Moshé Machover or Tony Greenstein can get us thrown out. So I will do exactly this. I send them my solidarity as I do to all those here today, wrongly expelled or suspended, and above all to Ken Livingstone, one of the best anti-racists our movement has ever produced. I and all of us here today will not be silenced. Now, there are growing calls for the left to leave the Labour Party. I oppose this, but if we stay, we have to fight as a visible, focal point of resistance. That is the only chance we have of stopping a mass exodus. The days of keeping our head down are over. And what is remarkable and inspiring is how many party members and constituency Labour parties have resisted without any leadership from the top. In so many parties we have said no, we do not accept your diktat. We will tell the truth. On the latest count, there are 80 CLPs who have defied the instruction to be silent, and I believe 235 secretaries and chairs representing 160 parties who have written letters of protest to the General Secretary-elect. We have repeated, and I do so today, the words that got Jeremy Corbyn suspended in the first place. Yes, the scale of the problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was, quotes, dramatically overstated for political reasons. And as someone who is Jewish, I am furious that Jewish members are being used as a political football in what is a blatantly factional manoeuvre. And I can do without these offensive references to the feelings of the Jewish community. Jewish people, of course, like all peoples, are diverse, Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist. There is not a single Jewish voice. Secondly, this is a fight against racism. And what is so disturbing is that the real racism in British society today against Black people and Asian people is in the Labour Party sidelined and relegated. Never mind Windrush deportations, police violence, disproportionate imprisonment, economic injustice, Grenfell. The Chakrabarty report made it clear. This was a report into, quote, anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. The report denied it, but there is a hierarchy of anti-racism. So how do we fight that? Now, I have been investigated and exonerated by the Labour Party for using the words Jewish exceptionalism. And this is how I answered it. Through political experience in a struggle and self-clarification, I have become a socialist, internationalist, universalist Jew. This means that I understand that the oppressions of peoples, religions, and classes is interconnected. Universalism is opposed to exceptionalism or particularism, which sees each oppression as separate from all others. I am opposed to all exceptionalisms, whether Black, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, or any other form of exceptionalism, which places the fight against one form of oppression above the fight against any other. I believe there is no hierarchy of anti-racism. To me, all racisms are equally abhorrent. Now, this divide between anti-racist struggles is dangerous. What happened at Millwall Football Club last week sent a shiver down my spine. Racist football fans attacking supporters of the Black Lives Matter bending of the knee as anti-Semites. I first saw that personally 5 years ago in Thanet, when the far right attacked us on the left as anti-Semites for attending a meeting at which Jackie was speaking against racism. Now, in those last 5 years, I've had the privilege, at times I have to say a doubtful privilege, of seeing these issues through the eyes of Jackie, my Jewish Black partner. I have seen and felt her pain and anger as she has been attacked and vilified, her heritages challenged, her ancestors' histories made invisible, with references in the papers before her disciplinary hearing to her, quotes, unhealthy obsession with the African Holocaust, a reference which the party refused to delete. Just imagine if that had been said about the Jewish Holocaust. And I remember my own history too. As a child, I was told Hitler should have finished the job and put you Jews in the gas ovens, or you Jews killed our Jesus. And at football matches, the singing, I've never felt more like gassing the Jews. Now, this was prejudice, not institutional racism, not an equivalent of anti-Black or anti-Asian racism depriving me of power. But it did have its impact. And this is the conundrum. There is a substantial socialist, internationalist Jewish left in Britain around the JVL and beyond. There is also a section of the right and among supporters of Israel, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who have cynically manipulated the issue of anti-Semitism as a weapon to defeat the left. Those like Angela Rayner, when she said that what Jeremy said may have been correct, but it was unacceptable to say it. Those like Margaret Hodge, trivialising the Holocaust when saying facing discipline in the PLP was like waiting for the knock on the door in Nazi Germany. But this is not just a binary divide, socialist internationalists against cynical manipulators. Life is rarely that easy. I was part of that generation of Jews born in Britain soon after the war, soon after the Jewish Holocaust. We were safe, and yet the Holocaust was part of the collective memory, the collective trauma of so many Jews, and still is. I know this because it was part of me too. For years, until at least in my 20s, I had this recurring nightmare, being chased and caught by Nazi concentration guards who took down my trousers, saw I was circumcised, and I knew I was doomed. Now, I remember a meeting of my previous CLP in Hackney some 5-6 years ago, early on in Corbyn's leadership, when the issue of anti-Semitism in the party first raised its head. I saw it among some right-wing young Jewish Labour members, a terror without foundation. And it wasn't contrived for political reasons. For them, it was real. And I remember my gut response was to feel sympathy, empathy. I didn't find the courage, but my instinct was to put my arms around one of the young men there and say to him, it's all right, you have nothing to fear. So there is this fear, at times terror, that has no basis in any current objective reality. And it is this which makes the crime of those who exploit this fear for factional purposes all the greater and all the more dangerous. So how do we begin to connect? Certainly not by conceding to the agenda that feeds that terror. Certainly not by apologising for something for which we are not responsible. Our answer has to be both, to understand and emphasise, and at the same time to tell the truth about the realities of racism in modern day Britain, and to repeat the message of universalism as their route out of the ghetto of exceptionalism, to connect, always connect the struggles, not reinforce the separation. Thirdly, this is a fight against the silencing of Palestinian voices, the voices which witness the occupation, the daily assaults, curfews, arbitrary arrests, detentions, house demolitions, travel restrictions, checkpoints, irrigation systems destroyed, exclusion and discrimination in the Israeli state and occupied territories. We've been told in the Labour Party we cannot say this, so let me say it. Israel is a racist endeavour. It is an apartheid state. It is a state, as Ian Pappy so graphically puts it, born of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And in today's Labour Party, we are banned even from discussing a motion to support a charity bike ride for Palestinian children. What a disgrace. And what connects all of this is the fight for freedom of speech and freedom of thought in the Labour Party and beyond. They're trying to prevent us from discussing the EHRC report, from raising the slightest criticism, even though it is fundamentally flawed, not just politically, but legally shot through with errors. To prevent us discussing the witch hunting of Jeremy and so many others, to prevent us from discussing the racist nature of the Israeli state. And now there are threats to free speech in our universities, which face funding cuts if they do not implement the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. This clampdown is sinister. We have to fight, but how? We cannot wait for our left leaders, and we haven't waited. Those CLPs and party secretaries who wrote a letter of complaint to the Gen Set, those heroes who didn't ask for or wait for permission, that is our inspiration, the basis and the beginnings of our resistance. These and our Labour left groups we have built in the last 6 years. We must connect and unite from the bottom, link up with the left of the NEC, the trade unions and beyond, build alliances and resist. It won't be easy, comrades, but there is no alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham, not just for having some real insight and brilliance and depth, but also for sticking to your time allowance pretty much. Anyway, I hope you have a good afternoon. Next up, I'm going to go quite speedily onto people because I want people to get a break. Next up, we have Kerry-Anne Mendoza, the editor of the Canary. And again, I'm not going to spend much time introducing her. Kerry is very able to introduce herself. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you, Jackie. So yeah, I just first wanted to say, you know, growing up, I'm autistic, I'm gay, and I'm Black, and I grew up in a largely white working class community on the edge of Bristol called Kingswood. And when I was growing up, I was not only learning about the transatlantic slave trade and apartheid in South Africa and the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, but I was living the experience of the hangovers of those racist projects. They're all around me in buildings, the names of buildings, the statues of slavers in the centre of town. And it became pretty clear to me that it was a basic matter of survival to understand white supremacy and how it works, because it was very likely that at some point in my life, I was going to have to fight it. And I want to be clear, when we talk about white supremacy, we don't refer to white as a colour. We refer to whiteness as a privilege group, because you can be considered traditionally non-white, but if you are working in the services of white supremacy, you will be gifted privileges from that group. And ditto, you could be born white, but if you become an active and successful opponent of white supremacy, you could have your white privileges revoked. It's really important that activists everywhere understand that distinction. Whiteness is not an ethnic group. Whiteness is a privilege group. And that really led me to Palestine. I've been reporting from and visiting Palestine for more than 20 years now. And it never gets any easier, to be honest, when you go. And that, to me, is the basis of my resistance to the witch hunt. Firstly, on the basis that any barrier to opposing racial, social, or any other kind of injustice needs to be ruthlessly and relentlessly fought against and resisted. And secondly, specific to this issue, is that we simply cannot allow Palestinian voices and those of their allies to be crushed in the name of a racist project. It is deeply insidious to see how the witch hunt has weaponized the language and the tools of anti-racism in the purpose of advancing the cause of racism, racial injustice, and social injustice. And any activist anywhere who claims to be interested in anti-racism, in racial justice, or in social justice, who is enabling this witch hunt, an active participant of it, or cowed into silence by it, needs to stop referring to themselves as any of those three things. Because really, those titles only matter when the fight is on and when the fight is dirty. Anyone can be an ally in fair weather. That's not allyship, that's sympathy. Being an ally when it costs you something, that's when it counts. And that's why I'd like to salute the bravery and courage of every single person on this call, whether they're on the panel or in the audience, and all of those people beyond this call who are fighting these fights on the daily. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Zionism itself in Israel. Zionism is an explicitly and unapologetically racist ideology. It says that one ethnic group is entitled to a piece of land, whether they were born there or whether they arrived there. They are more entitled to it than people who were born there, if they don't happen to conform to that ethnic group. That, by definition, is a racist idea. It's not racist to say that. And you really do have to do some serious mental gymnastics and engage in extreme intellectual dishonesty to argue anything else. And that is exactly what the witch hunt does every day of the week. And what struck me from embedding myself, not only in Palestinian society, but in Israeli society, is the inherent white supremacy with, again, whiteness as a privileged group that exists in Israeli society itself and is rarely called out or even spoken about in Western society. Israeli society is built around white supremacy. At the very top of the privilege pile are the Ashkenazi Jewish group. A little bit below them are the Sephardi. Now, the Ashkenazi would be sort of Western European, American, predominantly white Jews. Then you have the Sephardi, Spain, Portugal, Latin America. Then way, the big drop, and you have the Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are described as Jews from Arab countries, which I guess you would call an indigenous Israeli, considering that Palestine itself is an Arab country. And then way down the bottom, way down, are Black Jews, particularly African Jews. And one of the most predominant groups in Israel would be the Ethiopian Jews. And to give you an example of the difference, an Ashkenazi Jew who isn't even born in Israel, but say born in Boston, might go on a birthright tour of Israel when they're 16, be invited into the country, come and join us, you know, have lots of kids, help us deal with this demographic time bomb, all of this language, welcome, welcome, welcome. But how does Israel welcome Ethiopian Jews? When they arrive, they're thrown into something called an absorption center, which I see very little difference between that and a concentration camp. Extreme levels of control, bordering on torture. And just a few years ago, we found out, thanks to an undercover report, the Ethiopian Jews were being forcibly compelled to, they were basically given these long-term contraceptive injections called Depo-Provera. It's just breathtaking. And obviously any of us who are listening to this that are aware of the Holocaust and other systems of repression have those called back to us when we hear things like this. And I think to fail to call those out is a real failure of solidarity and a real failure to stand for the principles of anti-racism and universalism that Graham was talking about shortly before. But really one of the most shocking things from Israel for me, especially in the context that many of us right now are being called anti-Semites for pointing out that Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is and always has been an apartheid state. In fact, in 2011, the Israeli Supreme Court declared that there was, in an official ruling, that there is no such thing as an Israeli citizen. It doesn't exist. Why did the court take that position? The court took that position because if there actually were to be a universally agreed Israeli citizenship, then they would need to be accorded equal rights and equal responsibilities. And of course, that can't happen and Israel continue in its current form. It really is breathtaking when you find out about it. I had a conversation in 2014 with Ronnie Barkan, who you have the pleasure of listening to later today. I was interviewing him for a documentary I was making at the time. And at that point, I was a two-state solutionist. And Ronnie looked at me somewhat despairingly and said, "You can't call yourself an ally and be a two-state solutionist." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, aren't you black?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, if someone came to you and said that they were an ally in anti-apartheid South Africa during the 80s and suggested that the solution to apartheid was to give black South Africans notional sovereignty over the Bantustans while retaining the whole of white supremacist apartheid infrastructure in all of the cities, would you have considered that a just and fair solution to apartheid?" And I just stopped. It was like being punched with reality. That how can I have been regurgitating this for so many years without doing this making this basic connection between these two causes? Why did I see Palestinians' right to self-determination, to be an equal citizen of the country that they are born into, as any different to the rights that I would accord to black South Africans or any other group? It was because even I, who by that point had spent more than a decade fighting this cause, had still been socialized into the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, into accepting an unjust solution put forward by people who don't see Palestinians as fully human. And so if that can happen to me, it can happen to any of us. And the job of all of us, the job of any anti-racist, is not to pretend that we're not racist and not to pretend that racism doesn't exist. It is to own it fully. That it is almost impossible when you're living in societies as racist as ours, not to take on some of these ideas. You know, even people of color, even people affected by racism can be drawn into those ideas. So then I come to the witch hunt. The witch hunt is about taking these simple moral truths and clouding them with complexity, with logical fallacy, with unjustified excuses. Because the basic truth of this is, these people cannot win this argument on the facts. The facts are clear and the facts are simple. There is a clear oppressor, there is a clear victim. There is a clear right and there is a clear wrong. So what they need to do is muddy the issues. And that's what we've seen. And they could not have done it without the complicity of other interest groups who would have benefited from it. And that's really what we've seen across Germany at the moment, where you have a federal laws, you know, being passed against BDS, claiming that BDS itself, that's boycott, divestment and sanctions, is inherently anti-Semitic, which means that any organization in Germany that's dependent on federal funds, federal grants, cannot state a position that is positive or in solidarity with the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which is breathtaking in its application. And we have seen high profile members of German society, from the director of the Berlin Jewish Museum and beyond, losing their positions, being forced into resignations as a result of this law. And that really gives you a clue about where this is headed in the UK too. That's the job of the EHRC. That's the job of all of these things that we're seeing now, is to create legal precedent, not just social stigma, but legal precedent in order to enforce the suppression of this free speech and this, what is at its heart, an anti-racist movement. So the question is, what do we do about it? How can we fight it together? The first and most important strategy we have is solidarity. The failure of the Labour Party to stand up to this witch hunt when it began was not only a failure of solidarity, it was a failure of strategy, because we warned from the outset that the target was never us. We were the fringe perimeter targets. And over time, that witch hunt would advance and advance and advance until it took the Labour Party itself. And that is exactly what happened. We absolutely must be brave enough to speak up. Whether it's happening to us now or it's not, we have to behave as if it is happening to us. An attack on one is an attack on all. That is the only way that resistance works, because ultimately we have the numbers. The second point I would make in terms of how to fight this is to take a leaf out of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Make people pay the price of capitulating or enabling this witch hunt. Whether it's a company, an organization, a political party, or an institution, make them pay, ostracize them in return. The third strategy is political education. The witch hunt thrives on ignorance. The better we educate ourselves and our communities about the reality of Israeli occupation, about the history and the birth of Zionism, and about anti-racism itself, it's effectively immunizing and vaccinating people against the witch hunt. Because when they're armed with that information, they are less able to be swayed by superficially persuasive arguments delivered in the name of the witch hunt. And my final point, and I think probably one of the most offensive elements of the witch hunt for me, is the creation of a Holocaust hierarchy. It is deeply, deeply offensive to me that there are groups of people that behave as if Jewish people first were the only victims of the Holocaust, which they were not. We'll all be aware of the yellow star, but far fewer people are aware of the pink triangle, which was pinned to gay people. They're not aware of the black triangle that was pinned to disabled people. And as an autistic person, you know, people like me that were born in, unlucky enough to be born into Nazi Germany, were literally starved to death. You know, we were institutionalized and then left outside in the cold to get pneumonia. And our parents advocated it. They weren't fighting for us, they were actually advocating it, because we were considered a genetic threat to the Aryan master race ourselves. The lessons that we learn from the Holocaust, or the single lesson we have to learn from the Holocaust, is never again has to mean never again for anyone, or it means nothing. We have to understand that when racism, prejudice, and the evils that happen in a situation like the Holocaust or slavery happen, the thing that's wrong isn't that it happened to X group, whichever that group is. It's wrong that it happened at all. And we have to unite. And as Graham says, socialism itself has to be universal or it means nothing. Anti-racism has to be universal or it isn't anti-racism. And so our fights have to be united. We have to come together in our common humanity and our common goals to live in a more just world where sins of the past are not repeated again. And we have to stand for each other. Because if we don't do that, we've already lost. And as Jackie said, the moment we fight, the fight is there. I'm always go back to that conversation about fighting fascism. You don't fight fascism because you think you can win. You fight fascism because it's fascism. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kerry-Anne. That was great to be brought back to that issue of the basic injustice within all of this, particularly for the Palestinians and for other oppressed minorities. Okay, I'm going to go straight over now to Jonathan Coulter. Thank you, Jonathan.
I've been active on Palestine in the Middle East for 11 years, but this has developed into a broader concern for free speech and media reform in the UK. I led a complaint about misreporting, gross misreporting of a meeting in the House of Commons in 2016. You may remember that, a meeting which was chaired by Jenny Tong. And then got involved with a hacked off campaign and launched a judicial review against Ipso. You can read about that in my blog. I have been a member of the Liberal Democrats for only half the time I've been active on Palestine Middle East, 5.5 years. Approaching retirement, in fact, And I have to say, I am disappointed with party politics in general. Seeing a lot of sectarianism, tribalism, which prevents people talking to each other properly. And this is not only on the left or the far left, I find it among liberal Democrats. So many liberal Democrats are challenged on this, on what has been going on in the Labour Party, this misinformation and smearing over anti-Semitism, and say, well, this affects us all. And many of them are saying, oh, they recognize the problem, they recognize it's going on, but why are we going to lift a finger? Because these are the Labour people. I find that absolutely terrible, frankly. As a result of this sort of getting disconcerted with party politics, I'm more active on single issues, whether the Middle East, freedom of expression, or locally on active travel. However, I'm very happy to speak at this event. But I don't call myself a socialist. I identify with the idea of for the many, not the few. I don't know many people who really want politics for the few and not the many. And I like your group's unapologetic approach in dealing with anti-Semitism smears. Contrast this to pro-Palestinian people who often appease the Israel lobby in one way or another, sugaring the pill, hiding the truth, always talking about sensitivities, hoping to gain acceptance with the media or their political parties or whatever. And I'd have to put Jeremy Corbyn at the head of the list, I'm afraid. He's done so much, so much appeasing of his detractors. And also I've seen things come out of the Palestine Solidarity campaign, which are doing this. But in many other fields, many people do this. And I think this is one of the major problems. I therefore agree wholeheartedly with Kerry-Anne's recent article, How to Fight the Witch Hunt and Win, when she says, every capitulation emboldens them, and that's why it has to stop. However, I was less happy when Kerry-Anne presented the smear campaign simply as an attack on the working class and anti-racist socialists. Really, Kerry-Anne, your potential allies may take issues with this because they see this smear campaign as an attack on all of us. You may remember the names of Jenny Tong and David Ward. David Ward's actually present on this call. It's something which is corrupting the people and the institution of this country as a whole. Good things we've done in the past, we're no longer doing them because of this. The standards of the BBC have been lowered. If you want to win friends and influence people in larger numbers, we need more inclusive language, focusing upon what we have in common and not getting hung up on differences, which often turn out to be more semantic than real. The fake anti-Semitism campaign against Labour since 2015 is, as Graham correctly pointed out, the worst single episode of misinformation I have witnessed. The media has put out a uniform wall-to-wall narrative from 2015 and failed to report evidence that disputes it. It's a surreal situation where the BBC produces a documentary about Chinese treatments of Uyghurs, calling How to Brainwash a Million People, while itself contributing to the brainwashing of tens of millions of British people by more subtle means. But this is not just a problem for Labour. You may have seen articles I've published with other Lib Dems complaining about the way our party leaders supported the fake campaign and was totally unwilling to discuss the evidence. And how when we tried, the party establishment systematically censored internal discussion on this. And I've also seen double standards and hypocrisy in the handling of disciplinary complaints. Those disciplined on grounds of anti-Semitism were subject to humiliating treatment sometimes, not all allowed to know who is accusing them, nor the substance of their comments. That sounds very similar to what's going on in Labour. While complaints against supporters of the party line, they may misbehave on a grand scale with impunity. And you can, this is something of which I have the proof, of which the Lib Dems would rather not discuss. The way forward, I think we need to think in terms of Russian dolls. The small doll and the large doll outside the small doll. The smaller doll is the misinformation about anti-Semitism. The larger doll is a wider framework of misinformation in the UK resulting from the ownership and the operation of the media. And I suggest, if you haven't done so, you read that magnificent book by Nick Davies called Flat Earth News, which describes this in detail on the basis of his experience and research by the University of Cardiff. It is also, the big doll is about the dark anonymous money that finances wholesale misinformation in this country, pushed through right-wing political campaigns and think tanks in the UK and elsewhere. And here I recommend reading Peter Geoghegan, his magnificent book, Democracy for Sale. The small doll problem is particularly bad because all the stars are aligned. You have the Israel lobby support, and then you have the Conservative Party, and then you have the media, the right-wing, the Labour. They're all in a line. So that's why it's worse. But the large problem may prove more damaging in the long term. Let's think of matters of peace of war. The Lib Dems are justly proud that under Charles Kennedy, they opposed the invasion of Iraq while Labour and Conservatives went along with it. But it's often forgotten that this was a last-minute and close-run decision, accompanied by considerable hand-wringing from a timid party establishment, fearing tabloid press disapprovals and accusations of unpatriotic behaviours. This raises serious questions. What would happen if the Lib Dems broke rank? What would have happened if they broke rank much earlier and they got the dispute going earlier? Could they have influenced people in other parties, more people to vote against it? And what will happen next time with the growing authoritarianism within the political parties and the possibility even a war against Iran and people trying to drag us into it? How will our party and other parties behave? So we need to present the egregious campaign against Labour as part of a larger problem, a special case. We need to reach out to potential allies, people who are looking at the bigger doll. Think of the Hacked Off campaign, the Media Reform Coalition, Truth Defence, and all those who fought for full implementation of Justice Leverson's recommendation to rein in the press's ability to lie without evidence, to require them to for people to be able to complain more easily and get low-cost arbitration rather than spending £100,000 on legal fees, as I did with my supporters. So people there, think of the people involved in it. A certain Edward Miliband and a certain Charles Kenneth Clarke. These need to be our allies. They may not be working with us at the moment, but there they are. And then there are people fighting to expose the use of dark money and the manipulation of social media, like Mary Fitzgerald, Peter Geoghegan, Carol Cadwallader, all potential allies. sympathetic journalists like Peter Oborne, potentially sympathetic elements in other parties. Maybe the people in Conservative Middle Eastern Council haven't been speaking up much lately, but they have in the past. Think of, and maybe some of them, when they're retiring, will be prepared to come on board with something like this.
Jonathan, can I ask you to wind up now, please?
Yes, I am winding up.
Thank you.
In short, we need to reinvent the campaign as an inclusive one, welcoming British people of different political perspectives, but united in the vision of for the many, for the few. And I know you'll mention the fact of progressive accept on Palestine. And this is a problem with many of these people. We're going to have to fight that and challenge them sometime and look at different ways of engaging them. So to summarize, we need to think in terms of Russian dolls, move out of our sectarian echo chambers and focus on shared interests and avoid getting hung up on our differences that are often more semantic than real. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Jonathan. Good to get a perspective that is outside of the normal Labour perspective. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Kevin now to talk about the work we've been doing on freedom of speech.
The campaign for free speech has obviously arisen from many of the issues in the Labour movement and wider society on anti-Zionism, its equation with anti-Semitism, and indeed the wider questions of the IHRA. But a group of members of Labour Against the Witch Hunt and the wider Labour movement felt that really the issues have started to go much further, and that in particular the attacks on democracy and free speech were now being extended beyond issues of the Middle East, of Palestine, of Israel, and so on, now to really all sorts of critical voices, particularly voices that were questioning the legitimacy of imperialist wars, and indeed any critique of capitalism and the political status quo. So we've drafted a charter for free speech. It's available on the Labour Against the Witch Hunt website. It's a working charter at the moment, and what we're hoping to do is to flesh this out, and at a working conference on the 23rd of January to really get a definitive set of demands and charter so that we can campaign. The main areas that we're looking at are on the idea of linking free speech and democracy. That in particular, that the left historically, the Labour movement, and indeed even liberals argued that without free speech, without the freedom to comment, without the freedom to advance different views, there can be no form of democracy. And indeed, historically, the battle for democracy was the battle for free speech. I think all of us who've had any sort of schooling in this country will have remembered from our history lessons the battles for free newspapers, for unstamped newspapers, and for freedom to speak in public, the battles of people like John Lilburn in the 17th century, John Wilkes in the 18th century, and indeed various labour and trade union people in the 19th and the 20th century. So we see the idea of free speech as being central to political democracy. But we also think that this idea of democracy and free speech should be extended, for example, into the state itself. We've seen the attacks on whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, and indeed a whole range of whistleblowers who are less prominent. So the idea of an end to state secrecy, of opening the books, as it were, and exposing power so that it is transparent and so that we can hold it to account. Again, all part, I think, of the history of socialist and labour movements, but indeed of wider liberal democracy. But I suppose the key areas that we're looking at in the Charter are the rejection of the IRHA fake definition of anti-Semitism. People have already spoken about that. We'll be going on to look at that later on. And we all know that its equation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is explicitly designed to close down debate, and indeed even any form of criticism of Israel as a state, and indeed even of Israeli government policy, is then made taboo. And the situation in the Labour Party, from which I've been expelled on these grounds, is exactly that, that any form of criticism of these ideas leads you to expulsion and censorship and constraint. But we also looking at other areas of society, in particular the universities, schools and colleges, where intellectual debate, free exchange of ideas is absolutely essential. And I'll be speaking a little more this afternoon about that issue in the universities. Because what I think is happening is that there is an attempt to control the climate of opinion, to restrict what is acceptable, and political ideas that challenge are deemed extremist, and indeed increasingly, I think, unlawful. And attacks on BDS, attacks on anti-Zionist campaigners, I think, are examples of that. Lastly, we're wanting to advance and defend the idea of free debate and the idea that there should be restrictions on political debate and criticism. So these are the main sort of areas that the Charter looks at. They're laid out in a series of headings and then some further demands. Between now and January, I'd like everybody to look at the Charter and to consider amendment and development. The working conference will be a chance to arrive at this definition and then really begin the campaign in earnest. We want to get a full range of opinions, but we also think that this is a campaign that can't just wait to have endless discussion. We know what the problem is, we know what the dangers are, and a campaign like this is really the beginnings of a very serious and determined fight back against the restrictions on political democracy and free speech. If we don't, I think, make a stand now, then the areas will be closed down, we will be further and further restricted, and the sort of things that we've seen in the Labour Party and in the universities, and indeed in wider society, will just continue. So I urge everybody to read the Charter and to take part in the conference on the 23rd of January.
Thank you very much. Leah Levain has just made a very important point, which I think we should note, which is we should actually add draft to it, that it's a draft, so that, you know, it is open to being altered, changed, tweaked, whatever. You know, that's the whole intention of it. Can I also ask the panelists if they would have a quick look at the questions and answers on the bottom of the screen, so you can see the kind of things that people are interested in talking about further. Next to come up is Chris Williamson. Chris, 10 minutes, and I know that you can pack so much into 10 minutes.
Well,
so you'll have.
I'll do my best, and I've got a little stopwatch here as well. So let me start. You said to introduce ourselves. Let me introduce myself as a recovering Labour MP. Perhaps the best way of describing it. I want to change tack a little bit and talk about Julian Assange, who is the greatest exponent, in my opinion, of freedom of speech. And he will be spending a second Christmas in Belmarsh prison this year. That is a stain on the British state, in my view. And it's so important, I think, that we, all of us, garner as much support as we can to bring pressure to bear, to continue to bring pressure to bear, to build that movement, to secure Julian's release, because it's utterly untenable that he should be potentially extradited to the United States of America. And, you know, one of the things, of course, that Julian has focused on is exposing war crimes. I mean, this is why they are so exercised about the work that he was doing, the work that WikiLeaks was doing. And I mean, he's made the point, obviously, you know, that clearly, you know, people don't like wars, and they have to be fooled into accepting wars. We saw this, and we've already heard reference to it, I think, today with the speakers about the war in Iraq and how that was based on a bunch of lies, essentially, as we know. And so, you know, the number one enemy is ignorance, really, and it's so important, therefore, that we have the right to freedom of speech to at least try and, you know, counter the narrative which is often put out by the establishment. And so people like John Pilger and journalists of his ilk are few and far between. It's great to be on the panel this afternoon with Kerry-Anne Mendoza, who is a shining light. But when you look at the way in which the mainstream media hacks operate, clearly they don't sort of really deliver what a journalist should be doing, in my opinion. And you know, John Pilger produced a documentary a little while ago now about the coming war in China and how essentially China is surrounded by NATO bases and military hardware, and yet we get this constant narrative that China, you know, poses the threat. And of course, we're seeing the manufacturing of fear about Russia in this country, but actually in this country and in the United States as well. Of course, it's an absolute nonsense. But why is this happening? I mean, I think it's happening because there are very powerful vested interests who have skin in the game in terms of the arms industry, the military industrial complex in this country, and of course over in the States as well. They gain huge profits from their fear that is manufactured about places like Russia and China. They also, of course, gain hugely by the instability in the Middle East because they sell billions of pounds worth of armaments to them. I mean, I think Britain is the second biggest arms exporter in the world, and I think its biggest client is Saudi Arabia, which is perpetrating the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world at the moment in Yemen. And so it's really important, therefore, I think, that we have the right to freedom of speech so that we can call this out. But of course, we know that there is a whole panoply of agencies which are working against that. We don't just have the mainstream media, of course. I mean, there are things like the so-called 77th Brigade, which is a section of the British Army, which is devoted to using the social media platforms, often using misinformation, in my view. Certainly in terms of the organization known as the Institute for Statecraft and the so-called Integrity Initiative, which is an offshoot of that, which received millions and millions of pounds of public money. And that was being used, at least some of it anyway, to smear and undermine the leader of the opposition at the time, Jeremy Corbyn, and his allies. This is absolute outrage. I mean, I was asking questions in the House when I was a Labour MP still about this. We got some information out, but then this is how I discovered the multi-million pound contributions that they'd received from the state for their activities. But then they clammed up and used the excuse that in the interest of national security, it wouldn't be appropriate to provide the further information that I was seeking. So, you know, there are huge forces ranged against us, and it's therefore vital, I think, that we as a grassroots and across the piece stand up for the right to free speech, because it is most definitely under attack. And we know that the mainstream media is acting as the mouthpiece for the establishment, is acting as a mouthpiece for the military industrial complex. And we do not get the truth from the corporate media in this country on some of these really big issues. And I think it's therefore very clear what we're seeing in the recent times, how the freedom of speech is being clamped down upon by so-called liberal democracies. And I mean, it was an insidious effort in the earlier days and years gone by. I think it's now much more overt. I mean, and we're seeing the government passing legislation such as the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, which stipulates on the face of the bill the right for security services and the police to essentially commit criminal conduct. I mean, I think it's referred to as criminal conduct actually within the bill in order to allegedly prevent crime. So here we have a situation where the government is legislating to provide for instruments of the state to engage in criminal activities in order to prevent crime. It's kind of a bit of a contradiction in terms, isn't it? But some of the things that they set out in the bill, which actually would justify this criminal conduct, would be things like civil disorder. So, potentially, demonstrations and things like that could be deemed appropriate to commit criminal conduct. And also the issue of it was anything that posed a threat, I think it is, to the economic well-being of the nation. Well, it depends on where you're coming from in terms of the economic well-being of the nation. And we've had a sort of neoliberal economic status quo for the last 40 odd years. Both of the major political parties have obviously not when Jeremy Corbyn was a leader, but up until that time, and now with Keir Starmer, very much buy into the whole neoliberal agenda. So those of us who are concerned about the excesses of capitalism, those of us who would like to actually replace capitalism with a system that actually ensures that the fruits of the nation are shared more equitably around everybody, so that we can eradicate poverty, we can massively reduce inequality, and we don't have people dying on the street because they're forced to sleep rough. That could be deemed, a threat to the economic well-being of the state, could it not? And therefore that would be potentially used. So it's so vital, therefore, that we've got truth tellers, that we have truth tellers like Julian Assange to be able to expose this kind of abuse of state power. That's why they were so exercised about the role of Julian Assange exercising his rights to give information to us as a wider general public about the abuse of state power, the abuse of corporate power, as well as something which WikiLeaks was very much involved in doing. And they're doing their damnedest to close him down. So we really do need, I think, to get behind Julian Assange. And of course, we've heard this afternoon, should I say, about the witch hunt in the Labour Party, and it's kind of part of a continuum, I think. Really, we're seeing people who speak out in favour of the Palestinian people and speak out against the abuse of the excesses of the Israeli state being drummed out of the Labour Party, and now people are being suspended and expelled for the temerity of actually supporting people who have not necessarily articulating those views themselves, but merely for people have been kicked out of the Labour Party, for example, for supporting me or saying nice things about me. In fact, one woman was expelled, literally expelled, not just suspended, expelled from the party for wishing me good luck. I mean, you can't even express pleasantries now in the Labour Party without risking the ire of the establishment that control the Labour Party. And we know that the current leader of the Labour Party is a pillar of that establishment that is seeking to silence free speech. Let's remember, Sir Keir Starmer is a member of, the only parliamentarian who is a member of the Trilateral Commission, a shady organisation that was established in 1973, who were concerned about an excess of democracy that they'd witnessed in the 1960s, and they felt that they needed to do something. Basically, people were getting ahead of themselves and using democratic structures to assert their rights, and that was seen unconscionable to them. So this campaign for free speech that we're talking about today, it's not just some sort of airy-fairy issue, some extraneous thing which is kind of exercise the minds of the chattering classes, the kind of the liberal elite. It's fundamental to our rights as a nation. It's fundamental to ensuring that we get a fairer and decent society. So I'm very delighted and pleased to be part of this campaign, and we need to do all we can, I think, to grow it, to ensure that we can actually bring about the change that we desperately need. And it's not too much to ask for in a democracy, that we all have a right to the truth, and we all have a right to freedom of speech, to express ourselves without fear or any danger of being hauled over the coals for the temerity of stating the truth.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much for that. Next, I'm going to call Moshé Machover. I think Moshé needs very little introduction to anyone. He has been such a stalwart in this campaign, and of course, a stalwart supporter of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Moshé.
Thank you. My support for the Palestinian people derives from a more fundamental precept, and that is belief in socialism. That implies opposition to colonialism, in whichever form, including in particular the form of Zionist colonization of Palestine. Thank you for introducing me. I will mention that in October 2017, I was expelled from the Labour Party. There were in the expulsion letter insinuations of anti-Semitism, but that was not the cause for my expulsion. The reason, at least they gave a reason for, they accused me of some fake accusations which they had to receive, and therefore the expulsion was rescinded soon afterwards. This time I was suspended, but they've made some progress. Now they don't make any charge, they just suspend you. Instead of actually providing you with some reasons for the suspension, they, in essence, invite you to invent your own accusations. They frame a whole list of questions which you have to answer, and thereby, as it were, incriminate yourself. I'm not going to do it. I published, contrary to their instructions, I publicized the letter. It is on the internet. You can read the sly, lying weasel words that they use in their questions, which are based on nothing but fabrication. We are living in the time of big lies, very big lies, which are magnified and inflated by the current growth in media of communication. The big lies are on the traditional media, but they are also disseminated by the social media and so forth. In order to sustain the big lies, they have to attack freedom of speech. So this is the context of our rally today. We have to fight for freedom of speech, not just because it is good in its own right, it is necessary, it's part of democracy, but specifically in order to fight the big lies that are disseminated on a huge scale these days. I want to point out a couple of devices that are used in order to promote the big lie and stifle free speech. This first one hasn't been mentioned before, and that is the safe space ideology, or the safe space appeal to safe spaces. It sounds a very nice thing to do, to provide safe spaces for people so that they are not afraid of being victims of violence or of being abused. But this is not what safe spaces mean. The way it is used, the safe space lark is a device for people who are given certain people, not all of us, not everyone is entitled to this interpretation of a safe space. Some people are given the license not to feel uncomfortable, not to be subjected to hearing opinions which they find unwelcome. In other words, it is a device to stifle free speech. And it is interesting that this has been used in various devices by the labor leadership, but also outside the labor movement by the diktat that Gavin Williamson sent to universities, by the diktat of the present general secretary of the party, to give license to certain Jews and you have to be the right kind of Jews in order to claim that you are feeling unsafe when you hear anti-Zionist opinion. And people have made use of this. You can maybe recall various occasions in which Labour members of parliament at that time, who later resigned, made a very theatrical move when they claimed that they are feeling unsafe. They were feeling unsafe simply because they were hearing opinions which they found uncomfortable. So this is one kind of device which we have to focus on. Of course, certain Jews like Leah Levan or Jackie Walker or myself, we are not given the license to feel unsafe and to complain. I feel uncomfortable hearing defense of the Israeli settler state and of the Zionist project of colonization. I feel uncomfortable. I pity people who are deluded in defending these things. But if I claim that I feel unsafe hearing these opinions, these wrong opinions, I will not be protected by the safe spaces law. So this is one thing. But please note, we are talking about much wider issues than simply this fake campaign on so-called anti-Semitism. It goes far beyond this. It concerns the ability, the license for teachers to quote anti-capitalist literature. It is the ability to oppose imperialism. It is also wrong. I think I read yesterday a brilliant article by Mike Cushman, who pointed out quite correctly that it is not right to say that Keir Starmer or Gavin Williamson are tools of the Israel advocacy organizations. It is the other way around. These Keir Starmer and Gavin Williamson and the whole establishment are actually using the Israel advocacy groups like the Board of Deputies of British Jews, like the Jewish labor movement. They are using them as a tool in order to hit against the left, against Palestinians, supporters of Palestinian human rights, to hit against people who are advocating anti-imperialist views, opposing wars such as the disastrous war on Iraq and Libya and so on. This is a convenient tool which the establishment, including Keir Starmer, who is, as Chris Williamson has pointed out, is part and parcel of the British establishment. It is used by them in order to have their own wicked way. Let me go on to point out another device in fighting against freedom of speech, in supporting, in perpetuating the big lie. In this case, I will talk about the specific big lie of so-called anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. In order to sustain the hysteria that this campaign involved, one thing has to be guaranteed, that no one would be able to actually state and inquire into the scale of this phenomenon. Now you can say one case of anti-Semitism is bad enough. That's true. But there's a vast difference between isolated cases and an epidemic. let me give as an example this EHRC report, the investigation into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. People have pointed out that it has many faults, but there is one very symptomatic fault that really overshadows everything else. And it shows that the report is not just full of faults, but it was actually written with bad faith. Suppose you saw a document called Investigation into what? Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in the United Kingdom, okay? Something like this. Now, the first thing that you would want to see in this report is quantification. How big is, is this disease in the, how many cases? Is it isolated cases or is it an epidemic? How does it compare with other diseases, with heart disease, with cancer? How does it compare with the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in other countries? But if you, in this document called Investigation into Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in the United Kingdom, you find no attempt at quantification, you would throw it into the waste paper basket, because you would realize that it is written in order to disguise something. It doesn't ask the crucial question, the most fundamental question: how bad, how much? Now, you are not actually allowed to raise this question. The Labour whip was withdrawn from Corbyn because he actually raised this question. That was what he did. Now, when you raise this question, they twist it. They say you are actually questioning the reality of feeling of a lot of people in the general population, and especially among the Jewish population, who perceive that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Well, it doesn't. This question of quantification doesn't question their perception. Their perception is real enough. And it is real enough that a lot of Jews in Britain, and other people as well, non-Jews, think, they have the perception there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Why do they think it? Because they've been incited to think it, because of the campaign. The campaign, therefore, is its own justification. You first of all, incite people to believe, without any evidence, that there is a lot of, or imply that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And then when people actually come to believe it, you quote their belief as a reason not to question the quantification. This is a sort of circular logic that is beloved of the deniers of free speech and of proponents of the big lie. So I return to what I started with before. We are living in the period, in the era of the big lie, and therefore we need a big campaign for free speech, because the only way in which we can fight the big lie is to speak what we feel and not what we are meant to say. Thank you very much.
I mean, wasn't that brilliant? I mean, one thing that Moshé, well, not just one thing, but one of the things I always appreciate from Moshé is how he applies his skills as a logician to simplify things and make it obvious, and very often, I have to say, laughable at what they're actually attempting to do. And I wonder if it would be possible for us to get some of those points almost as a flash that we could actually send out to people, because I think it's just so effective. Anyway, coming on now to our final speaker, Craig Murray. I have actually shared a platform with Craig Murray. I think we were in a tent, but we may not have been, some time ago. And I know that he's a great speaker and a real advocate of freedom of speech. And I look forward to see what you're going to say.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, it was in a tent somewhere near Axminster, I seem to recall.
And I don't know about you, but I wasn't entirely sober. I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure about the other participants. I would like to start by apologizing. I wasn't meant to be the last speaker, I think, but I had a meeting with my lawyers, an unscheduled meeting with my lawyers this morning. And I'll tell you why in a moment. I'll also say I'm extremely grateful for inviting me to give my support and give my perspective. I've not been ejected from the Labour Party on the grounds that I've never joined it. Doubtless, had I joined, I fear I would have been. I'd like to, but before coming on to recent events in the Labour Party, I'd like to give a brief overview of the general threats to freedom of speech, which have become very, very sharp in the UK, and of which we heard from Moshé there. And I'll start, if you don't mind, just by mentioning my own case. I'm being tried in January for contempt of court up here in Scotland. One of the charges being influencing the jury. And it's the first time since Victorian times, the last time was, I think, 1880 something, that anybody has been charged with influencing the jury in favor of the defense, as opposed to prejudicing the rights of the accused. For 140 years, nobody has ever been charged with writing that they considered someone to be not guilty. I've been charged with that, which is a remarkable new threat to freedom of speech. And I personally, I'm not allowed to say this. There'll be another contempt of court. But my own view is I'm being charged of with contempt of court for motives which are purely political. It's a politically motivated prosecution. I'm also charged with jigsaw identification of witnesses, of protected witnesses. That's where you give clues as to their identity. We conducted an opinion poll conducted by Panel Base, one of the leading market research companies, who asked 1,200 people, according to their normal panel selection, whether they knew any of the identities of any of these protected witnesses, and if so, where they had learnt it. And quite a few people did know some of the protected identities. It would amount to about 400,000 adults in Scotland who know some of the protected identities. And they said, and most people said they'd learnt them from the BBC. And the second highest number of people said they learnt them from the Scotsman newspaper. And again, no one's actually published the names, but this is the idea that clues lead you to a name. And there was one individual who said that they learnt it from my website, but there were, I think, more than 20 mainstream media journalists named more often than me as a source of the knowledge. And not one of those people is being prosecuted, not one. BBC's not being prosecuted, despite being named far, far more often than me as a source of the knowledge. I don't believe I did reveal anything. I had no intention of revealing anything, and I don't believe I did reveal anything. But if anyone's going to be prosecuted, it should be the BBC. And again, the fact they're going for me, in my view, shows this is a political persecution. That this is an attempt to close down a blog and a journalist which publishes stuff which establishment doesn't want you to hear. And the maximum jail sentence is 2 years that I face if convicted in January. And there isn't a jury. So that's what I was busy doing with my lawyers this morning. I want to give you another thought on freedom of speech, and it relates as well to this idea of safe spaces and the prevalence of attacks on freedom of speech, particularly in our universities, and the ability sometimes to co-opt student groups, well-motivated student groups, into attacking free speech. An example I will give you is this. A few years ago, we had a meeting at the Oxford Union while Julian Assange was still in the embassy, and at which Julian was presented with the Sam Adams Award for Integrity. I was a speaker at that meeting. Julian appeared by video link. I was speaking live. Ray McGovern and others were speaking. I had difficulty getting into the Oxford Union because the event was picketed by a large crowd of students wanting to shut it down. And they were students who were picketing Julian because he hadn't gone to Sweden to face the sexual allegations, which were always false and have fallen through. But it was not an unreasonable thing to be picketing for. The motivation of those people picketing was good, though whether you ought to stop someone speaking on those grounds is a different question. But given what they had been told, given the knowledge they had, I have no difficulty with people choosing to picket on those grounds. And there were hundreds of them, and they made it difficult for me to get in. The day before, the speaker in the Oxford Union had been John Bolton. John Bolton. Not one student picketed the Oxford Union or demonstrated against John Bolton speaking in the Oxford Union. 500 people easily motivated to go and demonstrate against Julian Assange. Not one person demonstrated against John Bolton, war criminal, and I would argue, responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths or sharing joint culpability for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Not one student demonstrated against him. And that ability to manipulate the attempt to shut people down, the attempt to define what's a safe space and what is not a safe space, that's almost entirely a product of our billionaire-owned media and the fact that they've demonized Julian Assange for a decade, and they've never told you about the crimes of John Bolton. Julian's trial, of course, itself, which I documented, and which is an appalling attack on freedom of speech. Any journalist anywhere in the world who publishes classified information on crimes of the United States government is liable for extradition to the USA, even if they've never been there in their lives. That is the consequence if Julian is extradited. And the lack of media focus and the lack of focus of the political establishment, I would say that John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn were excellent on this issue. And from the Labour Party nowadays, we hear effectively nothing. I also want to mention the Prevent programme. I used to speak an awful lot in universities. My being able to speak, because a lot of the time I was speaking on the subject of the war on terror and against the restrictions, against the exaggeration, if you like, of the Islamic terrorist threat, against the wars in the Middle East, which can cause blowback and can cause terrorism. And I was, those were subjects I very often lectured on. And because of that, I found I was being stopped from talking because of the Prevent programme. And it isn't that the Prevent programme were putting out instructions that I shouldn't be allowed to talk. It was that if you have a speaker coming and speaking on those subjects, you have to, the person organising the meeting had to fill in so many forms and involve the police and involve the university authorities, and it became a deterrent. It became impossible to go and talk in UK universities on the restrictions on civil liberties caused by the war in terror. And Prevent remains a major threat to freedom of speech. It remains a major drag on the pursuit of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. It is often used against speakers on the subject of Palestine. And again, it's something on which the current leadership of the Labour Party is just insufficiently strong. The Prevent programme has an appalling, chilling effect in our Muslim communities, where people are scared to express a political opinion in case they should get reported. So I want to highlight also the Prevent programme as part of this attack on freedom of speech. All of which, of course, leads us to what the increasing difficulties of being able to express any opinions critical of the human rights abuses of the Israeli government. I personally, I stick to the rather old-fashioned view that the ultimate solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict should be one state, one single secular state of Palestine that everybody lives within. And there are different ways of exploring that. One of the jobs I had in the Foreign Office was I was a head of the Foreign Office Cyprus section at one stage, and we were putting forward with the United Nations peace plan options for Cyprus, which in many ways have similarities. You have two communities fearful of each other. You have territorial division. You have displaced people. But it's taken as granted by the international community that the ultimate solution to Cyprus should be a single state. And yet, for some reason, it's an anathema to state that the ultimate solution to Palestine should be a single state. Of course, it should be. It's a very similar problem. A single democratic state has to be the way forward. I find myself accused of anti-Semitism for saying that. I find that absolutely astonishing, and that's because I'm denying the existence of the state of Israel. This attempt to limit debate, and of course, anti-Semitism, for historical reasons we all understand, is an appalling accusation to throw at anybody. And one of the strange things is, I have friends who work in the mainstream media. I have friends who are fairly right-wing members of the mainstream media, and well-known people. And I put to a couple of them, I said, you don't actually really believe that Ken Livingstone or Jeremy Corbyn is a racist, do you? You don't actually really believe that. And no, they don't. They don't believe it. But strangely enough, when they're at work, they do believe it. And it's really quite a peculiar phenomenon. People are writing things that they don't actually really believe themselves, but they know they have to conform to what the state is imposing. And I think we've entered a very, very scary stage of state-imposed narrow lines of thought. For me, what's happening in the Labour Party, and the fact that people are asserting things which are plainly nonsense and acting in a way that they know is not right, and are doing it because that's the way your career can get on and you can progress within the UK state as currently constituted. That's a society which has become very sick indeed. And I find it very, very worrying. I used to say I'd never been in the Labour Party, but I have a lot of friends in the Labour Party. Nowadays, I have to say I've never been in the Labour Party, but I have a lot of friends who've been thrown out of the Labour Party because not many of my friends in the Labour Party seem to be surviving. It's simply appalling. It's appalling on a human level. It's appalling in the denigration and humiliation of some of the best people in the country, frankly, who are suffering abuse. They should never have to suffer. And I'm delighted that today we have so many people here willing to stand up against it, because the only way to end this is for everyone to be willing to stand up and say no, and we need more people to join us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Thank you. I think what we're going to do now, Tina, you're going to have a summation of some of the questions that have been asked. We have actually only 20 minutes. So I think if speakers could keep themselves limited to about a 2 to 3 minute response, which if anybody doesn't know how long 3 minutes is, it's never enough. So just say something quite briefly, and then we'll get through quite a lot of people. Okay, Tina?
Yes, very briefly. I mean, there's been huge amounts of questions and comments in the Q&A and the chat, and I'm not surprised. What an inspiring number of comrades have been speaking here. It's really good. Can we criticize Jeremy Corbyn? Isn't he the reason we're here today? How should we criticize him? Is it worth fighting in the courts, which is, of course, what Chris Williamson is at the moment doing, and a number of Jewish Labour Party members have started a legal action? Or is it not that the people with the deepest pockets are likely to win? What do we do about the Labour Party? Do we stay? Do we fight? How can we fight back? I've been posting in the chat a little answer to that. Please join our December 15 meeting to discuss how we can actually, those who've been expelled and suspended can fight back, but other issues. Two-state solution, one-state solution, regional solution. I mean, this is perhaps not the meeting to get to all of these issues. The crucial question, though, and I think this is actually started because Moshé touched on it, is the question: safe spaces, zero tolerance, free speech for racists. I mean, these are questions, actually, we had a similar meeting, but they go really to the heart. If we call for free speech, are we allowing right-wingers free speech as well? My view is yes. Other people have different views on that. But these are issues that go to the heart of our debate here. I'll leave it at that. It's enough.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in a very disorganized manner. So the first shall not be last and the last will not be first. For you to come back with a kind of 2 to 3 minute comment on what you said. And this time I will actually really interrupt you if you do go on too long, because I want everybody to have a chance to come back. So Jonathan, would you like to unmute yourself?
Be very aware of what happened with the hacking scandal and the big attempt which was made to rein in the abuse of the press. Wasn't quite successful in 2018. The reforms to the amendment to the Data Protection Act was defeated, but there was a big trial. And that was moving towards a situation where you could actually hold people, hold journalists, hold press accountable for misinformation, where you could challenge them at low cost. So I think this is the way we should be thinking, rather than sort of trying to restrict comments by right-wing racists. On the question of Justin Schlossberg's truth defense, I know there's a question on that, and Media Lens. Yes, these are organizations, and particularly Truth Defense, which I thoroughly support, and I think that's the way forward, because they are, looking at it forensically and seeking to reach out. They will be seeking to reach out to the other parties or people outside of the left, as well as focusing on this terrible abuse we've seen of the Labour Party and the left of the Labour Party, and getting the big picture. What I said earlier was about the large doll, focusing on the large doll rather than the small Russian doll inside it.
Can we go on now to Chris Williamson? Chris, would you like to have your 2 minutes?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it right to criticise Jeremy? I mean, I think Jeremy's mistake was in not being strong enough in taking advice from people who didn't know what they were doing. And as a consequence of that, we are in this situation. Had, I think, Jeremy listened to people like myself who was urging him to stand up to the smear merchants, to stand up to the Israel lobby, then I'm convinced that I'd still be a Labour MP rather than a recovering Labour MP, and Jeremy would be in number 10 and would be in the process of transforming the country. As for using the courts, yes, I do think we do need to use the courts, and it is obviously a very expensive proposition. But if we stand in solidarity, if we contribute collectively, then we can defeat them. I've taken on the Labour Party after I was suspended, beat them in the High Court, took on the EHRC after they were proposing to name me and beat them. We've actually represented and supported other activists and people, and we'll be filing some more cases in the High Court next week or the week after, taking on the Labour Party, people who have been unfairly suspended. So I do think that we have to take them on at their own game. You know, two can play lawfare, and we intend to play lawfare, and we intend to win. As for the Labour Party, should I stay or should I go, as the Clash once sang, I think the only thing we can sensibly do now is to go. There's no means of wresting power from the right wing of the Labour Party. There'll be incredible amount of frustration if we stick with the Labour Party. People will stick with the Labour Party. So I think, obviously, people make their own choice. It would be far better to help us build an alternative vehicle outside the Labour Party, a social movement and an electoral vehicle outside the Labour movement. It's been done in this country before when the Labour Party was founded in 1900, replacing the political duopoly of the Liberals and the Tories. It's been done in other countries. We can do it. We just have to be confident in our own sort of collective strength, as it were. And in terms of free speech, I would just merely quote Noam Chomsky, who said, if we don't believe in free expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Moshé, you have your 2-3 minutes now.
Thank you. I won't address all these questions. It take too much time. As for criticizing Corbyn, yes, I think I agree with what Chris Williamson has said on this. As for fighting in the courts, be very careful. Make sure that you have really an ironclad case, because the courts are not neutral. The courts are part of the state, the courts are part of the establishment. On certain procedural questions, you may expect to get something approaching a free trial. But don't be tempted to fight political battles on political ideas in the courts. Be careful what you do there. As for staying in the Labour Party, yes, stay, but the point of staying is to fight the bastards who have taken control. Don't stay and speak out. I have stayed and spoken out, and I'm now a suspended member of the Labour Party. I will continue to speak out. I will not resign. I could now resign from the Labour Party and save myself the subscription fee. But I will continue to speak out and to expose their lies. As for one state, be aware that in order to achieve a one state solution, which is a perfectly decent idea to put forward, perfectly well-meaning in the best sense of the word, this will require overthrow of the present regime of Israel. The present regime of Israel will not accept it. And then you have to raise the question how this can come about and who is able to perform this transformation. I see no way in which this could take place without the participation of the Israeli working class. It is not going to happen by outside forces. I don't think that there's any realistic possibility of this. And it's not going to happen in the present situation. So I think you have to think very, very deeply about this very decent idea of one democratic state. And please remember that the Zionist regime also wants a one state. It wants a one state, but without too many Palestinian inhabitants in it. And the Zionist regime has an option which the apartheid regime in South Africa never had. The South African regime of apartheid needed the black people. It couldn't get rid of them. It was the labor force which sustained the South African economy. It couldn't do a Nakba with a black population of South Africa, which was the majority, because it was a necessary part of the South African economy. For the Zionist regime, which is a different type of colonization, more like the colonization of North America or Australia, the indigenous population is surplus to requirement. So the Zionist regime has actual plan in case of a favorable situation, what they call a propitious hour of actually perpetrating another major Nakba. And that will be their version of a one-state solution in favor of Zionist colonization.
Thank you very much, Moshé. Craig, would you like to come in now? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry. Yep. Very briefly indeed. On free speech, I'm essentially in favor of free speech. I think it can be limited, but only in extreme situations. John Stuart Mill wrote that it's perfectly respectable to say that a corn merchant is a thief who starves the working classes. That's fine to say. But if you say the same thing to a raging mob with pitchforks and torches outside the corn merchant's house at midnight, then it's not okay to say that. And I think context is everything, and it's whether what you're saying is causing a threat to people, a threat of harm to people, which is important, which is where in certain circumstances and in certain societies, it's right to ban racist speech, and I think it probably is right to ban racist speech in our society at the moment. It's not really for me to say whether people should stay in the Labour Party, because I'm not in the Labour Party. I'm actually a member of the SNP, and we had we've been having similar problems with an increasingly right-wing leadership moving in directions which the party members don't want. And there I've urged people to stay in and fight, and we've essentially taken back control of the NEC at the last party conference. So it's difficult for me not to advise my Labour Party. I would say to you, and this is what I feel of the SNP as well, which I'm in, you need in the short term to actually change the leadership. If you're not going to get rid of Keir Starmer, there's no point in staying in. So stay in to get rid of Keir Starmer. Staying in if Keir Starmer remains leader is absolutely pointless. And I would give that a 2-year window. And I should say, I feel exactly the same say about the party I'm in. If we can't get rid of Nicola Sturgeon in 2 years, I shall leave. I think those are my thoughts at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. And Kerry-Anne.
Goodness gracious. I'm not going to try and take all the questions similar to Moshé. It's going to eat up all the time. But on free speech, I go back and forth on that issue, as I'm sure most people do. I do think, for me personally, there's a really thick line, not a thin line, a really thick line between hate speech and free speech. But in practical terms, the issue that we have at the moment is that any time there is some sort of mobilization to stop hate speech, it then just gets weaponized against those of us who are exhibiting free speech, and the hate speech just carries on regardless. So it is a really difficult situation to be in. And I think in the context we're in at the moment, I think we almost need to back away from censoriousness in its entirety, because it just feels like any time there is a program in the mainstream to censor hate speech, it's only ever used against the left anyway. So there's that. In terms of Corbyn, I think my views on this are pretty well known. Appeasement never works. It was a flawed strategy. It was a failure of solidarity. and it did enormous harm to the movement. And I wish that that approach hadn't been taken. I would concur with Chris's explanation of why it happened. There were people, you know, I call them the optics left, surrounding Corbyn, which, you know, say, well, if we sacrifice this group or this bit of our programme, we might have a chance of advancing this other part of our programme, which is just, that's New Labour strategy, you know, and socialism is supposed to rest on universalism. You don't cut one group off in the hopes of benefiting another. You say, no, we're all fighting together, and everyone's fight is important. Everyone's need is as important as everyone else's. So it was a failure. In terms of staying in the Labour Party or going, I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I left when they adopted the IHRA, because for me, I simply cannot be a member of an organisation that has that on its books. And I was also aware of me being quite a high scalp to take in terms of suspension, and I didn't want to give the witch hunt the pleasure of being able to celebrate my my suspension and expulsion. But ultimately, I think back to putting ourselves in Starmer's shoes when Corbyn was the leader. What was more annoying, the establishment of Change UK or centrists within the party consistently, you know, frustrating the party from within? And both did damage, but probably the internals were worse. So I actually think we should be supporting both strategies. I think it's really easy to start agitating against each other and going, I'm leaving or I'm staying, and arguing. I actually think we should all be absolutely backing new socialist movements with everything we've got, and we should be lending our support and solidarity to those inside Labour who want to deal with Starmer and the centrist threat.
Thank you, Kerry-Anne. I just want to say a few things for myself. One is, when you get into this ridiculous situation where my partner can be expelled from the Labour Party for sharing a platform with me, where people can be named by the Board of Deputies and become, just like they were in South Africa, banned people. And I think in terms of this issue about censoring, when you've got organizations like Hope Not Hate, who actually invert what hate is and debase anti-racism, I think we all need to think about where we're going in terms of censoring speech. I mean, we've had a great morning. Can I remind everybody that we are coming back this afternoon, so please come back and see everybody here for 2:30, I believe, 2:30. So I think this afternoon is going to be just as good. I know those panelists myself, and there will be good conversations. I want to say thank you to all the panelists. And thank you to, actually, we've had over 300 on this platform, and that doesn't even take into account Facebook or when it goes out recorded. So thanks to everybody. Thank you very much.